Hello and welcome to Design for Mechanical Textile Recycling webinar. This was recorded on the 20th of April 2020 and I am Cathryn Anneka. I'm a PhD researcher at the Centre for Circular Design. I hope you enjoy. Thank you. This webinar really is to look at the research that I've been doing for my PhD. I'm going to kind of look at mechanical textile recycling or design for mechanical textile recycling in a very broad way. As Letitia pointed out, this session was designed for students, but we welcome everybody. So I might cover some things that you do know and hopefully some things that maybe you haven't thought about before. Something else to point out, that my PhD research is obviously at the Centre for Circular Design, but is also funded by the University of the Arts London, as well as the Cotton Textile Research Fund. So I'd like to thank them. I probably throughout this webinar will be referencing other sources as well as some of my own research, and you can find these on my website at www.annekatextiles.co.uk. There's a resources tab and I've already put a Word document with some links for some basic ones, and I will be updating that after the webinar as well, so you can have a look, particularly if anything came up in the questions section as well. I'll add that in. The webinar will also be recorded and will be available from there and possibly on Instagram as well. So to give you a little bit of a background about me, I was a designer in industry. I used to be a knitwear designer, predominantly men's. These are some of my sketches from when I worked for a supplier, and I was designing for brands like ASOS and Primark and New Look and all those kind of things. And so that's kind of where I started. But the problem is that I was really interested to know what happened to all of those jumpers once I designed them and people were getting rid of them. And I was obviously very concerned about the vast waste that was occurring in the fashion industry. And that sort of launched me going back to do my MA and then going on to doing a PhD and really looking into this topic. The problem is that waste doesn't look as beautiful as my previous picture. It's complicated and it's messy. This is a picture that I took when I went to a textile recycling plant because I really wanted to understand the system, understand how it all worked. And it sort of led me to understand a little bit more about the circular economy. So the context of my research is based in the circular economy, and the circular economy, just as an overview, is an economic system that that replaces kind of the end of life and the wastefulness and throwing away things with first reuse, then thinking about remaking, and then thinking about recycling. It happens over lots of levels, from the micro to macro, but importantly, its aims is for environmental quality, economic prosperity, and social equality. Now, of course, today I will be focusing solely on the recycling aspect, but that kind of gives you a kind of broad context of where I'm working at the moment. So waste is slightly more complicated. You can't just bundle it all into one. You have post-consumer waste. So for those that don't know, I'm sure you've heard this all before. A really simple explanation is post-consumer waste is anything that the consumer throws away. So that's me and you buying things, not wanting them anymore because either they're worn out, they've gone out of fashion, lots of different reasons, and then we get rid of them. Of course, there is pre-consumer as well. That tends to be more factory waste, clippings. Both are equally complex and waste sources. Some can be seen as easier than others. But what I'm really going to focus on today is post-consumer waste. That's where my research is predominantly based, and the problems that are involved with that. So this was me and my master's in the sorting factory. I wanted to understand where the clothes went, how the system worked. And this is me standing in the freezing cold because it was snowing, separating jumpers for my master's project, in which I then recycled. So how does textile recycling work? When we get rid of our clothes, what happens to them? So first of all, recycling is a textile recycling system is a terrible name for the system. Recycling actually only covers one tiny part of it. So first of all, you have reuse. So when we give our clothes away, if they are able to be reused, they get sorted in these big facilities into hundreds of categories, and then they are shipped around the world. Now, I have to point out that my research predominantly is based in the UK. So lots of the information that I'm providing here is based on what happens in the UK. So there are slight differences depending on where you come from and where you are. And I know that this is a webinar, so you might be from across the globe. So in the UK, it gets collected, it gets sorted, and then it predominantly is shipped out to Africa, because that is our main market. There are lots of different markets across the world, but the UK and European clothing tends to go to Africa. Those are sold through a huge network of people, and they are sold on the second-hand markets over there. There's positives and negatives to that. We could have a whole other webinar talking about just the reuse sector, but unfortunately we don't have time for that today. The second thing that happens is if there are clothing that cannot be reused, that either are no good for reuse or there's no market for reuse, they tend to get chopped up into wiper cloths. Now, when we think of remaking, quite often as designers, we think of upcycling and beautifully create a product, and that is amazing. And there are some incredible designers doing some things out there like that. But predominantly in the industry, what happens is that they get cut up into squares, and they're used, as I said, wiper cloths for mechanics, for window cleaners. There was even an example of a washing machine company buying them in to stain them, to practice to see how well the machines were taking the stains off. So lots of different applications. Unfortunately, this tends to be a one use before disposal, which is obviously problematic. Great that it's being reused, but obviously not for a kind of long amount of time. Then, of course, we have recycling, which will be the focus of today. You have two different types of recycling. You've got mechanical recycling and chemical recycling. The focus of this webinar is mechanical, but we might be coming back to chemical recycling briefly at the end, and I know that some of you might have questions. It's not my area of expertise, but I can do my best to answer anything that you might want to ask. So in terms of mechanical recycling, you have three kind of different methods that tend to be, this is kind of an overview, that tend to be used. So the first one, the highest quality, is if when you mechanically recycle and they go back into yarns and material, which are used for garments. And we're going to be looking at that a little bit later. The second is when you recycle, and a big market is blankets. So blankets for the charity sector, so relief blankets. These are used, for example, if there are earthquakes or massive disasters and you need to get something warm for the people that are suffering in that area, and that's what those blankets are made. That industry tends to be in India, so they recycle and create those blankets, and there's lots more information about that that you can find out about. The third, which is the most common in countries like the UK, that happen directly in our country, is that you recycle the clothes and they become insulation, that kind of, or the type of coverings when you move house and you've got that purple kind of felt that's protecting your items. That's all made of waste clothing that's been recycled. It tends to be very low quality and not particularly desirable, but still really useful. So those are the kind of three, but as I say, I'm going to be focusing on the kind of higher quality, how we can get mechanical recycling back into garments at that kind of level. So of course, finally, you have the incineration. Now, incineration can be used in countries, particularly in Scandinavia, for energy, which is a good thing rather than sending it to landfill. Landfill is something we want to totally avoid. But obviously, there are real problems with incineration. You want to definitely be doing some of the other things first. And lots of our clothes, on the whole, tend not to be designed for this. So that's why it's last on the list. So one of the biggest problems is that 10 years ago, according to the Dutch Clothing Mounting, you can read this report, as I said, on my website, was that 80% of the clothes that we were getting rid of were wearable versus unwearable. Now, the problem is that the trend is that this wearable faction is getting much, much bigger, and it's looking more 50%. We haven't got exact numbers to be able to look at that. There are lots of studies that are being done, and this trend is sort of being shown and demonstrated. So that's really the problem that I'm kind of looking at and focused on. So mechanical textile recycling, it's what to do with this, all this waste that is unwearable and cannot go into these reuse fractions. So I've done some field research in Prato in Italy. This is where wool recycling, it's a hub for wool recycling. And predominantly most of the wool that gets recycled that goes back into sort of high quality garments, fabrics, is conducted. Everything from this point, when I'm talking about mechanical recycling for this webinar, will be focused on wool, and that's because this is where I did lots of my research. But wool recycling actually was the first type of recycling. It was invented in the UK in 1813. You can read a little bit more about the history. Again, I've put a link on a document that might be of interest to people. And then it's transferred over to Prato. So it's a really great place to start in terms of thinking about mechanical recycling and the way that it can work. Now, it did start hundreds of years ago and has been going for a really, really long time. But more recently, the industry in Prato created what's called the Chordata recycled certification. And this is to kind of promote the fact that they're doing recycling, that it's an environmentally thing that they're doing, and they're trying to up the market. And in order for something to be certified, it has to be produced in the region of Prato, which is just outside of Florence in Italy. It has to have 65% recycled content as a minimum. And it needs to have a life cycle assessment. So that means thinking about the impacts such as energy, water, any of the savings that are made through this recycling process. So let's get to the actual recycling process itself and how it works. So first of all, you can see that the items are sorted. So we've talked a little bit about sorting, but that were tended to be for reuse. We'll come back to that later. They then get manipulated, they're pulled, and they're turned into fibre. Now, from this point on, from the fibre stage, it's looking very much like a virgin production line. The only difference is that when you have recycled materials, you have to treat them slightly differently. So although it looks very similar, you do have to think about the way that you produce them in a different way. So you would blend them. Again, we will come back to blending. Card, which is kind of a combing process. They're then spun, turned into yarn. They either go into a weave or a knit, become fabric, and then obviously continue down the train into a product. So when we're thinking about the feedstock, particularly in Prato, the focus is on wool, and that's obviously what they most desire. So you have actually lots of different companies. You have the ones that are really focused on the highest quality. You'll have companies looking at cashmere, some people looking at really high quality wool. And then you have companies that are looking at the slightly lesser quality of wool. But it's all focused around what wool percentage is in the mix. So while you do have people looking for the most pure, there are people that are dealing with some of the blends as well, as long as it has wool in it. So then we come to the sorting. So I wanted to kind of break down the way that the material is sorted. So you have your input. It tends to be that you would separate knit from weave. Knitted fabrics on the whole tend to be looser and therefore easier to pull the fibers from the fabric. You would also sort by colour. Now this is a really important stage. First of all, sorting happens in family colours. So reds, blues, navies. Then you would sort those into different shades. Now you can get very specific shades if you want them, or you can have looser shades. One of the factories I was visiting was sorting between different shades of navy, between dark, mid, low navy shades. It was really impressive. I mean, to the point where I could almost not tell the difference, but they have very skilled workers there. One of the places I visited also was separating between ordinary and fine, and that was in terms of knitted garments, so chunky knits versus fine knits. And then they go on to clean. So I will come back to cleaning in a minute, but the idea of this sorting stage is really, really important because you want to avoid contamination. So contamination of colours can really affect the quality at the end. And that's really, really key when it comes to recycling. So cleaning is the next process where labels, potentially seams, buttons, zips, and actually colour contamination. So designers, obviously we like to design jumpers that have pops of colour, you know, a neck that's a different color from the main part of the body, that needs chopping off, because any of that color will get into the yarn. It could change the overall color of the fiber batch that is being recycled, or create little nets of color which you don't want in terms of contamination. So, seeing as we've been talking about color, when it comes to the end, when you're using recycled fibers, the client, quite often in the fashion industry, we're very specific about the colors. And actually mechanical recycling on the whole, wool as well as cotton, I've researched into both, have the ability to separate and create, through blending, Pantone match, basically, colors. They can combine colors and create Pantone match. You do hear about overdying, and that tends to be multicolored fabrics, which obviously are not great for the mechanical process. These get overdyed in black, predominantly, but you also find overdying if you're trying to create a specific color and you haven't got one element that you would need for that specific color. So you might overdye some fiber in order to put it into the batch. And this is where you can really understand that mechanical recycling and the process that you use to be able to get these beautiful and quality materials is very complex and actually involves a lot of work and a lot of design in the elements of it. So blending is my area of focus. It's what I'm particularly fascinated in. And obviously we have the issue of blends coming into the process, but as I've demonstrated, some places in Prato, they are looking at blends where you've got 50% wool, 50% acrylic, some other fibers in there as well. And they'll be able to create quality materials out of those as well. They're for different things, for different reasons. But blending doesn't just come down to fiber and the way that the fiber, I've already talked about blending of colors. So blending kind of encompasses a lot more than just the complex nature of the feedstock coming in. You also have to remember that blending is really useful in mechanical recycling. When we recycle and the machinery pulls the fibers from the clothing in order to bring them back down to fiber stage, they do get shorter. So the actual nature of mechanical recycling, it has come in leaps and bounds from when it was first invented, and they can be quite clever, and the settings of the machines, I'm no expert in the technical part of this, but in order for the types of, or depending on what you're designing, will depend on why you need to blend, what virgin materials you might need to add, what types of things you would add for strength, for aesthetics, for cost. There are all sorts of reasons why you would blend. And those need to be considered when we're thinking about designing with recycled materials. You then, of course, go on to spin in the yarns, and predominantly it tends to go into woven materials, because the shorter fibers are easier caught when you have a tighter yarn, and tighter yarns tend to be used for woven materials. So let's kind of go back to the overall context. This is a diagram by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, A New Textile Economy in 2017. And I kind of want to draw your attention, I mean, obviously shocking 73% are landfilled or incinerated, and that's something that we really need to work on. But I want to draw your attention to two particular figures. So the first one is that less than 1% of our textiles are closed loop. So this means that they're going into the same or similar quality applications. In order to do this, the design guides that we have out there are to think about monomateriality. I've been talking a lot about wool and about how the focus is always about wool, wool, wool. So if we keep our designs monomaterial, it makes it much easier for the recyclers. Also disassembly. Now, as Letitia also did her webinar last week, you can see the recording, learn a lot more about disassembly for textiles. An interesting watch. She's also written a paper, which I've included, which might be interesting for you as well. So if we can disassemble back to those monomaterial, then we can more easily recycle. The problem is that our textiles are really complicated. Now, Letitia has done some amazing work. This is also her diagram, so thank you, Letitia, for letting me steal this today. But I just wanted to demonstrate how complex our textiles are, that we can blend in so many different ways, and actually monomateriality and disassembly are excellent in terms of design approaches. but they might not be appropriate for absolutely everything. We should aim and strive for that, absolutely, particularly in the current climate where that is the way that we need to be designing in order for our materials to be recycled. But looking into the future, it might not be possible, and it might be very, very tricky. And actually blending can be creative, as Letitia also says in her research. And that can we kind of think about how that could be a creative approach. So going back to this closed loop idea, the idea is that you obviously keep everything completely closed into a circle, where in contrast, you think about open loops where materials flow between lots of different circles. The issue is that you might have things flowing into different circles, but what you don't want is a break in that circle. Now, in the textile industry, we're brilliant at open loop. Fishing nets, nylon into swimming costumes, plastic bottles into plastic fleeces. The issue is that we're not very good at textile recycling, and we tend to break the circle, and that's where the massive problem lies. So I now want to draw you back to the second figure, which is 12% is cascaded recycling. Now, when we think about cascading always seems a really negative thing. It's really, really bad. It's terrible. It's downcycling. It's, it's lower value, as it says here on the diagram. But I wanted to kind of bring you back to the circular economy diagram, which Ellen MacArthur Foundation in 2013 released their report on this. For any of you that don't know the circular economy, I would encourage you to have a look at their website. They've got loads of resources, but essentially it's about keeping materials in the technosphere on one side and the biosphere on the other side separate so that they can go round and round in beautiful loops. Now, I would like to draw your attention to the biological side, because cascading is actually part of the circular economy. It's built in. Now it has to be used carefully and we have to think about it, but my research is really looking at understanding cascading. I want to think about materials and how actually we do want to be creating higher value materials that are cascading up in the value chain, but also some of those really low value materials. So earlier I was talking about recycling becoming insulation, or that felt stuff that you use when you move house that's purple and squelchy, all of those things. There's a place for those. We need those materials. There's a use for them, and they have to be made from something. If we're not making them from recycled textiles, then they have to be made from virgin materials, where there's a demand and a product and a design for that product. We have to think about the materials that are being used. So if we're not using recycled textiles, as I said, then we would use virgin materials. So my point here is thinking about the appropriateness. What you don't want to do is you don't want to go from the top straight to the bottom, or necessarily the bottom straight to the top. We have to think about this and design it. I think the main thing is that I would like to point out here is that although I call myself a designer, I would also call myself a systems thinker. And I think that's really important when it comes to understanding the mechanical recycling system, as well as how it looks holistically, where we can zoom in and zoom out. So if we can use recycling as a creative challenge, we can think about how we might be able to cascade and think about our textile materials and how they can go through these recycling cascades more appropriately. And this is really the focus of my research and where I'm going. The idea is that we can design for recyclability, and we've seen lots of the challenges, thinking about monomateriality, thinking about disassembly. There's so many great resources, lists of do's and don'ts, thinking about chemicals and toxicity, and thinking about how we can design for the end. But let's not also forget that we need to design from recycled, and that actually is more of a challenge than we think. They don't act like virgin materials because they're not, but they are an amazing resource and we do want to use them for longer. So you need to be able to combine both recyclability and recycled and join those two together. So as I said, my research is focusing purely on mechanical, and I did mention that I would be talking a little bit about chemical recycling. I don't think that chemical recycling is pointless at all. I think it's amazing. I think it's an incredible future technology. We are only currently at pilot stage or lab stage, depending on the technology that you're looking at. But they're scaling up, and we've had progress in leaps and bounds. in the last few years. And so it's definitely on the horizon and something that I think can work together with both mechanical and chemical. And this is where we sort of go outside of my mechanical recycling research, and this kind of goes beyond the scope of what I will be doing in my research, but I can't help myself thinking about the overall picture and system. So the idea is that mechanical recycling should be able to work with chemical recycling, and the two should be able to interlink. And that's kind of my idea for the future, and something that I would love to be able to research into further more. But as I said, my current research is really focusing on understanding this side of this diagram. And then hopefully in the future, I can broaden out as this chemical recycling technology comes into play. Thank you very much. As I said, that's my website, and hopefully the recording of this will be on Instagram.
Thanks a lot, Cathryn. That was really, really brilliant. Thanks. And I mean, obviously, I know quite a lot about your work, but it's really great to have it laid out again. So, like, there was a question from like quite early on in your talk, and someone was asking like what the reason is for unwearable textile percentage to go up instead of like that proportion when it went from like 80% wearable versus 20% unwearable, and like if you could talk a little bit about that in those early stages of the sorting.
Yeah, of course. I think there are lots of reasons for this. I'm no expert, and there's plenty of research out there that that you can read. I'll put some more links up there for that afterwards. But I think lots of it will be around the consumption and the fact that our consumption rates are increasing. So the more we consume, the more that we waste and get rid of. Also, the growing middle classes tends to be something that's often cited, that we have more expendable cash, we tend to want newer things, we get rid of things quicker. The rise of fast fashion, this idea of constantly new, super cheap, £1 items of clothes, all of this is kind of compounding. As I said, I'm no expert in this particular area, but I can see that some of those reasons are the cause for why we've got so much more unwearable. It's the also lower quality as well. It's not so bad if you're getting rid of something of high quality, but it's this lower quality clothing, which is much more difficult to then reuse and to go in some of those systems before. I would really like to point out, because I actually forgot in my webinar, that it's really important that although I'm focusing on recycling, that you actually remember, and at the beginning, that you do reuse, remake, and then recycle, and that is the order. So although my total focus is on recycling and how that works and how it might spiral around, that's not forgetting that you haven't got this system in place before, and hopefully others will be able to research and be able to put that stuff in place before it comes to what I'm talking about.
Yeah, really, yeah, I totally agree. We've got another question here. So as a small designer, how can we take part in the fabric recycling process? What kind of agency do we have as like small designers?
Sure, actually, it's really interesting. There's loads of things that you can do whether you're a student, a small designer, or whether you're working for a brand. I mean, at the moment, I would say if you're designing, as a student, be creative. Find out as much as you can. Knowledge is power. Hopefully you've learned a little something from this webinar today, but understanding more about the system and what you're designing for is only going to help you. So as I said, as a student or someone that has a slightly more freedom, be creative. Think about how you can design within some of the boundaries that are set within design for recycling, monomateriality, disassembly. I mean, I know as a designer, I get really excited about trying to reach the outer parts of that boundary box. When it comes to being a small designer, obviously, if you have your own business, there are slightly more risks at play. Again, definitely being creative, knowledge, trying to learn as much as you can so that you can make those informed decisions. But I would say that the most important, and this applies particularly for brands and designers that are working in bigger companies, is collaborate. You don't necessarily need to know everything. If you can find somebody, so for example, I know hardly anything about chemicals, but if I want to know about chemicals, I'm going to go and find somebody that can tell me about them, that knows about them, collaborate with them, I have the luxury of being a researcher, so often can get in touch with researchers and say, oh, this is really exciting. We work on big projects. There is some really great examples of how huge projects have brought designers, scientists together. Two that I can think of that I've been lucky enough to witness is the Mistra Future Fashion project in Sweden and the Trash to Cash project, which was European, across Europe. And all of those look at how you collaborate, how it can be really tricky, particularly when you're thinking about industry with supply chains, but you have those supply chains set up, and you just need to think about how those supply chains might work slightly differently. And it will take time, of course, but picking up the phone, sending an email. I obviously in this time of lockdown do not go out and visit people, but in a time where you could, that obviously would be an option.
That's really great. As a follow-up question, someone was asking how you would recommend designers go about getting in contact with recycled wool suppliers from Prato, for example. And I thought you might be able to expand a little bit on like that aspect of like relationship building. That's a huge part of your research. And just because just to add on, because you were mentioning like the Trash to Cash project and Mistra Future Fashion project, someone was asking where the document with all the links can be found, and it's on your website, right? That's
yes. So if you if you go to anekatextiles.co.uk /resources, although I will say I will be updating it after this session. So if you go back and double check that I haven't added any extra resources, but yeah, it's on there under the resource section. I put it at the top as well. So you should be able to find it really easily. In terms of getting in contact with materials, I think it's really difficult when you're a small designer. It is really hard because quite often minimum order quantities. I mean, I found this in my research. The way that I research is industry based. So I like to think of lots of theories, get really excited, and then try and do them in practice by using the machinery that would be used. Attempting at a scale, there's obviously barriers. I can't do everything at huge scales, costs and time being one of the key things. But I'm always faced with the kind of minimum orders. Things have to be done in big batches in order to make it cost effective. There are lots of reasons, but I would say that if you're trying to source materials as a small designer, think about, I would go to the sustainable material providers. There are loads of examples out there, and I can't think of any off the top of my head at the moment, but a few that I follow on Instagram. And if you're asking for those types of materials, there's power in numbers. If you can get lots of smaller designers to come together, it doesn't always work, of course. I know that this advice is great unless you can actually find the people to collaborate. But it's really important. And if you are able to get in contact with a recycler or anyone that you're trying to collaborate with, building relationships is totally underrated. It's so important that you listen to people, that you understand that they know more than you do, even when you think that you've kind of heard it all before. I mean, the amount of times that I've gone and spoken to a factory and they've talked to me about the benefits of wool, there are so many benefits, and I would never cut them off because they are the total experts. And in amongst some of the facts that they might have told me and I might have heard a million times, there will always be a total gem and something to learn. So it might seem like a really obvious one, but actually it plays a really big part in the research that I do and the people that I work with and have been able to work with.
Mm-hmm. So we've got quite a few questions coming through here, and like just to take account of time, I'm going to try and combine a few. And we had a question, so it's basically about materials, and so someone was asking like how you would include polyester in recycling systems, because a lot of clothes are made of polyester. So like, what would be your take on that? There's also sort of like questions around sort of like maybe your findings around recycling cotton in mechanical ways, and sort of like just generally, is anyone recycling wool or cotton in the UK? So maybe if you could just like give a quick overview of like maybe the differences between those different materials in regards to mechanical recycling and like what the like system is at the moment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think the key takeaway from what I've learned and mapped and understood about the industry is that you tend to recycle things in slightly different ways, which is why the industries are slightly separate. So why you wouldn't want to combine wool and cotton together, or polyester and cotton. So the key difference between natural materials and synthetic materials is that synthetics, if you're mechanically recycling a synthetic, you would melt it and you would turn it into pellets, and then it would be re-extruded into fibres. Slightly different from when you're chemically recycling it, so as you're using chemicals and you take those down to a molecular level. Again, I'm no expert in chemical recycling, so please do go and read more about that if you want to know. On the other side, on the natural side, you've got wool and cotton. Now, because although they are recycled in very, very similar ways, you wouldn't recycle them at the same time because they need very different conditions on the machines. So cotton is a much shorter fibre. You tend to find cotton in jersey fabrics. You do get knitted cotton garments, of course, but predominantly you've got woven and jersey, and therefore are much tighter and smaller. You get much smaller fibres. The way that it's pulled on the machine is totally different than the way that you would pull wool. So that's the reason that they're kept kind of separate. So you've kind of got these three, in very broad sense, systems where you've got synthetics. Nylon actually is recycled in a very different way from polyester. You wouldn't want to combine those two either. But cotton and wool as well. So they're the kind of animal, vegetable and mineral kind of systems that we have there. I think, is that, if I covered everything? I can't remember the beginning question.
Yeah, I think that gives a good overview of like why it's different to like deal with all those different materials. We've got sort of like a really interesting question here around like more like the process. And if I can find it again. So the question goes, are you looking into design methods to deal with waste, to make new garments out of this waste, not just new fibers? This person's really interested in like the design perspective that comes from like these type of material.
Sure. So I think this is where it comes back to me thinking as a design or design thinker, as well as a systems thinker. So I'm quite a lot of my like my thinking tends to be systems related, but then when it comes to actually testing that in practice, I very much put like my designer hat on. So I am taking, so I'm looking at wool and wool blends, and particularly acrylic, and the issue of that we constantly combine acrylic with wool, which is my experience as a knitwear designer that I did all the time. And how this kind of seen as really low quality material can be designed and created within a system to become a high quality product for a garment. So the testing that I'm going to be doing for my PhD, lockdown dependent, is creating a recycled yarn that would then go into a jumper. So thinking about the design decisions along the way. So what I have, when I think about the literature and when I'm reading and coming up with the ideas of what I think will work, I then try and do that in practice and see what all of the challenges and the stuff that you just don't think of because you think it's going to be that easy and it never is. So that's kind of a basic review of what my PhD hopefully will be.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting, and like sort of like to go on to the next question and like maybe take another step out. So like you're talking about the fibers and the materials and then sort of like the product. And here we've got a question from someone, so I'll just read it out. So in the Netherlands, I'm helping setting up a closed loop post-consumer textile waste, collecting, sorting, chemical recycling, spinning new garments. How could we start a big closed loop project at a European level, working with several countries in the EU / VN? UN maybe?
Wow, big question. I would say that would be connecting and finding out what research calls and bids that there are out there. I can't think of the top of my head exactly where you would look for that, but there is plenty of research funding available. You just need to find it and know about it at the right time when it becomes available. Connecting with researchers that are looking into this area. So at the moment I'm doing my PhD. As much as I would love you all to connect with me, I'm kind of focused on my own little area of research. You want to be connecting to the researchers that are working on some of these bigger projects, and being able to find out if there is any funding for you to get involved with and be a part of the big project. What you might need to consider if you're wanting to be a part of that is that there will be research aims that might not necessarily be completely focused on what you're looking at. So it will be a collaboration between the research that they want to happen and what you want to do, just as a warning. But I would wholly encourage people to get involved in research, because this is the only way that we'll be able to push the industry forward.
Great. Sort of like going back more like into the fibre, we're like going in all sorts of dimensions in these questions, but could you talk a little bit more about how successful or difficult like mixed fibre garments, okay, like is it impossible to mechanically recycle something with a mix of acrylic, viscose, wool and elastane, for example? So I think that really like touches on the crux of your research, which is about dealing with this complexity. And
yeah, no, of course. I love this question. No, it's not impossible at all. I, in my master's project, was like, well, we've got all of these jumpers and they're all mixed fibre. I sorted them all out into colour. I physically went through all of them, so I felt all of them. So although I didn't know what was in them, I got a real sense of how mixed the quality was. I know that there was some cotton, some linen, some cashmere, some wool, loads of acrylic, of course. So I would say it was predominantly acrylic, and I was able to recycle it, and I was able to work with a spinner to turn it into yarn. I made some interior products. And if you go on my Instagram and scroll all the way down, way back when, you'll be able to see some of the things that I was doing. And yeah, I think that the challenge is not because designers can't be creative and we can't use materials that are mixed and problematic. It's more the systems that they're within and how tricky it is. It's much easier for one person as a small designer to have vision and to be able to turn complicated waste into amazing, beautiful product. It's very difficult when you have that within like a big supply chain, and making those decisions and making it practical for performance. You know, on a craft level, it's much easier than it is when you've got lots of different red tape at various different levels. So it's about, if you're in that position as an industrial designer, so I'm constantly balancing my sort of kind of craft one person research with actually what happens in industry. So as an industrial designer, that's why I come back to kind of collaborating, you know, speak to the people down that supply chain, find out what's possible, and also don't be scared to challenge. So many times I've been like, are you sure we can't do this? Why don't you give it a go? And that happens loads in research, and designers love to poke and be like, go on, give it a try. And you know, sometimes it doesn't work, but sometimes it does, and it can really pay off.
It's really great. And sort of like, just to actually close the loop on this whole like thinking about recycling, I'm combining sort of two questions here, but the idea is like, how would you go about designing in like the best possible way to think about these circular economy sort of like imperatives? Like, what if you were designing from virgin, what would be like the best kind of mix that would allow for future recycling? And also, like, if you're designing with recycled fibers, how do you make sure that that can then be further recycled in the future?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this is kind of the crux of what I'm thinking about for my research, and it's complicated and it's really difficult. I think the easiest way to design for recycling is thinking about monomateriality. You want to basically make it as simple as possible for the recyclers. I mean, the recyclers need to make money. You have to remember that all of these are industries and people's livelihoods, and no one's doing this just for the good of the environment. It's all part of that ultimate goal. But the recyclers ultimately would love it all to be mono and not have to worry about it. Or in fact, actually, the recyclers themselves, as long as the machinery is set up and it's producing fibre that they can then sell into a market, is totally fine. The problem is that when you have this fibre stuff that nobody really wants and is really difficult to do anything with, that's when it becomes problematic. You're not even going to bother recycling it in the first place. So I think in terms of being a designer is, yeah, again, try and understand the recycling industry as best you can. Think about simplifying. It seems like a really boring and uncreative solution. And if you don't want to simplify and you do want to be creative, well, more creative, sorry, and you know, you don't want that kind of boundary, think about design for disassembly, or think about how, you know, what the next stage would be. I would also think, just because you're thinking about design for recycling, it is really, really important, but also think about design for reuse and design for how it can be remade and adapted. You know, we want our clothes to last for a really, really long time. And there are loads of really great strategies. I will put a link up for, I haven't at the moment, but a link up for design strategy cards that are available to get you thinking about how you can make products adaptable or, you know, like changeable. So there are loads of other design methods as well as recyclability. And I think the key challenge that if you could genuinely combine some of those things, if you're making something that's not going to necessarily go particularly well into a recycling industry, think about what it would then turn into. At what point down the value chain, if it's not going to necessarily come back into clothing, could it come back into an interior product? Is it just best for insulation? And at that point, if it's just best for insulation, you want to make sure that that product lasts for a really, really, really long time. You might have something that doesn't need to last for a really long time. Perhaps it's only going to be worn for a set amount of time, but you want that to come back in at a higher quality. It's really, I said it was complicated, but it's kind of balancing how you as a designer can be creative.
Yeah, we've gone over time, but I mean, well, we might as well just like finish with these questions. There are two more that I'd just like to ask. One person was asking around about what's the role of the user, the consumer in this, and I think it tagged on quite well to what you were just talking about.
Absolutely. I mean, the user is so important. You know, I'm assuming that most people sitting here are designers of some sort, but you're also consumers and users of products. And while you are being informed just by being here and any other research that you do, lots of those consumers are not that informed. And I'm always surprised, even my friends who I harp on about recycling, how little they actually don't know. Because obviously I'm engrossed in this topic all the time. But consumers are really important, and actually it's a really important part of a brand, whether you're a small designer, a big designer. The communication to the consumer is really important, because they can't make sure that their clothes are not being just put into the bin if you haven't told them what they need to do. They can't adapt their clothing if that's what you want your design to do if you haven't communicated that to them. So the consumer plays a huge role, but remember that the consumer, without wanting to be rude, can be really, really stupid. So you have to make sure that it's really clear. And I am one of those stupid consumers in many, many areas where I know nothing about certain things. So yeah.
Great. Thanks a lot. And then, like, just to wrap up, like the last question is, I mean, the question goes, when are you supposed to be finished with your PhD? And I would just like to expand a little bit on that question. Like, maybe could you like quickly give us some like milestones in terms of like how your research is like going about? What are the, like how this knowledge is actually being sort of like going through the stages of the actual academic research?
Yeah, of course. So my PhD is 3 years, and my 3 years finishes in October. Or crucially, my funding runs out in October. So I will be going into what's called writing up status, which means that I am a student, but I'm not really paying fees. They're very minimal. And I basically need to tweak my PhD. So the aim is to get it all written and done and dusted by October, to tweak through to some point next year where I will then submit. I will then have an exam, an oral exam called a Fibre, and I will be critiqued and challenged and questioned, and I have to defend my research. After my Viva, it is very likely that I will have some sort of corrections to make. My examiners might have some suggestions and things that I need to do, so I will probably be given between 3 and 6 months to do those corrections, and then it will be done and dusted. So I imagine by next October, so October 2021, it will be published and ready for you guys to read. But in the meantime, hopefully there'll be some other stuff for you to get going with, and if you have any questions, you of course can contact me.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks a lot. That wraps it up brilliantly. And like you were saying, you have published stuff already, and like anyone can go onto your website to sort of like glean any information that's out there already. And thanks a lot to everyone who sort of like suggested sort of like projects to look at, or like who've like highlighted their own work in the chat. That's really great, and we really encourage like this kind of like community to like keep sort of nourishing itself. And like thanks a lot for all being here this morning. Great.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach me at www.annekatextiles.co.uk. Thank you.